Hi, everybody. Hello to all of you in your homes. Welcome back for those of you who were here last night for our first attempt at this conversation with Mark Doty. Very sorry that we couldn't get it working last night, but I'm extra glad that you are joining us tonight and we're able to make time again. I have a couple of practical things before I introduce Mark briefly, and then we will leave plenty of time for your questions at the end of my conversation with Mark. And I want you to know how best to ask a question in this platform, which is not to put things in the chat box, but rather there's an ask a question button on the screen, sort of in the middle of the screen. And if you could put your questions there instead, that would be perfect. If you see a question already in the queue that interests you as well, there's a kind of little arrow next to all questions, and you can click that. That will upvote that particular question, and then I can get a sense of cumulative interest and make sure to get to those questions in particular. Also, if you want to buy What is the Grass, the book we're talking about, this beautiful book, that of course would be great. You can order it online from Labyrinth at labyrinthbooks.com, and then it will ship for free in New Jersey. Or better yet, you can give us a call during our phone hours, and then you'll get 10% off, and they'll ship free anywhere. And the phone hours are on our homepage, and we'll also put them in the chat box with the phone number. Finally, a shout out to our good friends and partners at the Princeton Public Library. In normal times, we do lots of co-sponsored events with the library, sometimes at the store, sometimes at the library. And so we're doing that now online as well. And tonight's conversation is among many Labyrinth and the library live streams. If you want to know more about those, you can follow either of us on this Crowdcast platform, or you can sign up for our newsletters on our home sites or follow us on Facebook. There are lots of ways to make sure that you know what our programming is, and we would love to see you at other events. But now, I'm so happy, Mark, that you were willing to switch to this medium with all its hitches and glitches to celebrate your new book with us, What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life. Most of you likely know Mark as a poet, a memoirist, a critic. And if you are being introduced to Mark Doty only now, well, then lucky you. There's so much that awaits you. Mark is the author of, I think, 10 books of poetry. I'll just name Fire to Fire right here, which won the National Book Award. He wrote 3 memoirs, and also wrote 2 books on writing, which are The Art of Description and Still Life with Oysters and Lemon. In these last 2 books, the teacher in Mark shines through, and that's true of this new book on Whitman as well. Mark, for his day job, is professor of English and I think still director of Writers House at Rutgers University. And I should also say that the folks in the English department at Rutgers were great in helping us to get word out about this live stream. So thank you to anyone who's watching from that department. So Mark, I thought I'd give a very brief sketch of the book to hang your and my conversation on for those who haven't read it. And then I get to ask you some questions before we open it up to everyone. And I'll also ask you to read a couple passages. Really, I just want to say how very much I love this book. It's many things at once. It's an ode to Whitman as poet, and as the one who cleared a path for much poetry, queer or not, that came after. It's a portrait of Whitman against the backdrop of New York City and of America in the second half of the 19th century. It's a close and always illuminating reading of Song of Myself and a handful of other poems. And then, as the subtitle has it, the subtitle is Walt Whitman in My Life, is also the record of Whitman in Mark's own life. And that part turns on the affirmation of queer desire, of love and pleasure among what Whitman calls comrades, and for which he is a source. And I think it turns on a kind of liberation in language that goes back to Whitman. And those memoir parts unfold in very intimate stories, stories of Mark's early and puzzling marriage, and of lovers and loves that came after. And they are parts that appear like a kind of carefully scored accompanying voice. So you end up feeling in reading Mark's book kind of counterfactually a bit like you're also getting Mark Doty in Whitman's song. So there's some sort of reversal or osmosis that happens there. Yes, Whitman in Mark Doty's life, but curiously as you read, Whitman's lines, of which many are quoted, get inflected by the record of Mark's experience, sometimes in counterpoint and sometimes in harmony. One more thing, maybe finally, for me, like maybe for some of you watching too, it's not been straightforward to find what to read and what holds my attention right now in this moment. But Mark's book, and then also the occasion to reread Leaves of Grass, have really been a gift. There's so much affirmation there, never simple affirmation, always strong and direct, and a sense of being held in a large metaphysical embrace, if that makes any sense, which is kind of existentially consoling to me. And then there's also just the sheer pleasure in the immediacy of the language, Whitman's language and Mark's language, and here, well, you get them together. So, Mark, with that thank you note out of the way,
thank you, Dorothy. Wonderful.
I thought maybe we can start by talking about how you organize the book. And in order to do that, jump in with a line from one of the first stanzas of Song of Myself. The book is organized around what you call 5 sources of Whitman's poetry. And I hope we'll get to those or some of those. But maybe first you can help us think about what we are even asking about in the first place when we ask about the sources of poetry. And Whitman's line there is, "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems." Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. Characteristically humble, Thomas. What does that mean, and how do you interpret it, maybe for your own thinking about the sources of Whitman's poetry? Let's maybe start there.
You know, you make me realize that I don't address that line in the book at all. I think I was puzzling at it myself, and still am in some ways. But I think the word that really stands out for me in that is stop. It's not stay with me, this day, not to stop. Mm-hmm. And you know, Song of Myself ends with that word too. I stop something, waiting for you. If we will stop for Walt, he will stop for us. There's reciprocity in it. I think he means if we sit down our other concerns, if we give our attention, if we keep company with him, if we're willing to as he asks us to listen with all of our ears, all of our senses, we will have an exchange of a sort with this poet. And for him, I think that exchange probably is the secret of all poetry. The poetry happens in a place where we meet, where I begin to dissolve into you, the boundaries, or lack of boundaries between self and other. We meet in the place where our humanity becomes visible, which I think is in the places between us. For Whitman, the edge of the self is always fluid, permeable, variable. And that may be his most important quality. You know, you read through Song of Myself, and he talks about I, he talks about you, and sometimes you is his reader, sometimes you is a lover, sometimes you is his own soul, sometimes not for you, as it might be some particular other, we don't know. At one point, he even talks the language. How's it go? Oh, speech, he says. Oh, speech, he says. There are buds beneath you, oh, speech. So that poem can address everyone. I think the I, you, identity is always blurring, and that may be the secret of all poems. Maybe these poems is simply being together.
Yeah.
He doesn't say just stop the day. He says stop this day and night with me.
Yeah.
Invitation to go on a date. Yes.
Yeah. You've thereby, in answering this, you've already pointed towards a lot of other dimensions of your book, the I and the you, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more. The you, I have a sort of sub question there for myself. I think that as a reader, as a woman in that text, you have to include yourself in the universality of his address before you can include yourself in your own specificity. If you're, maybe for me as a woman reader, differently perhaps than for a male reader. That took me time. I fully got there this year, but after many attempts. Do you want to say something about his relationship to women before we get to queer desire, which we definitely will have lots of time for?
Whitman had great empathy for all people, and he had an enormous respect for women. He believed strongly in women's rights. He had many friends in the sort of new feminist world of New York and Brooklyn in particular in the 1840s. But when he writes about women, he does honor their desire. He is one of the few people at that era who's willing to grant women actual sexual desire and to embrace that. But he makes them maternal very quickly. So D.H. Lawrence said that for Whitman, women were always a function. And there's a certain truth about that their task, their mission in the world is to produce healthy offspring. So he just can't hide what his desire is. And when he becomes he talks about wanting to incorporate you, the reader. He wishes he could push through the page against the cold type and the ink and get all out of the way and just climb into your lap. I think women often feel a little uncomfortable with that. It's a little too much. Because in a way that suggests that the man is going to take over. And when he says every atom belonging to me is good belongs to you, it sounds more like to women he's often saying every atom belonging to you is good belongs to me. I don't think he meant to do that. And I'm glad you could sort of move beyond the concern about that towards a sense of being dissolved in his universal view.
Oh, very much, very much. But I had to get there because there is a feeling of caricature around this kind of reproductive abundance that is ascribed to women and so on. But for sure,
there's this amazing section in Song of Myself when Whitman puts himself in the voice of a woman who was watching 29 young men bathing. These soldiers swimming. And this speaker or this mask for himself as speaker, is so delighted watching these young men's bodies sporting, the water splashing. It's so erotic. And it's especially erotic in a sort of forceful, driving, traditionally masculine way. It's sensuous, surrounding. And I think, there's something there that feels like he wrote about it.
Yeah. Oh, there's for sure. There's all of that, and that was meant as more of an aside than I think I've turned it into. So let me come back to your quick mention of how important the dissolving boundaries of the self are, and that seems to me to be connected to what you describe as the first source of poetry, which is a kind of an openness also to a mystical experience, to a kind of a visionary experience. And there are several experiences of your own that are experiences of apparitions or of a kind of communion of being visited. So maybe I can invite you to talk about that however you like, either in regard to Whitman or yourself or both, and then perhaps also read for us that beautiful passage where you come face to face with Whitman. So talk to us a little bit about that first source and then read for us, if you would.
Well, as a person who teaches poetry, teaches the writing of poetry, it is not unusual for us to touch upon matters in conversation about forms of experience that's heightened, that's beyond the ordinary. And I think most persons I want to say most creative people, most artists, and I really would extend this to most persons, at some time or another have an experience of losing boundary, of feeling a sense of oneness, of not ending at the borders of your skin. As Whitman said, I am not contained between my hat and my boot soles. So what is that experience? It's when we forget ourselves, we get absorbed in the moment, and we don't feel separate from the moment and what surrounds us in the moment anymore. At its least, in its smallest manifestation, it sort of happens to us very frequently. At its greatest, I think that's something like what Buddhism would call enlightenment, or Abraham Maslow would call peak experience. You know, this is something that is a fulfilling, larger sense of being more than your own limited ego in your enclosed sack of skin. I think Whitman experienced that very powerfully, and probably more than once. There is no record in prose, no diary, no. But those experiences in the poem seem to be unmistakable, and particularly in the story, which is very near the beginning of Song of Myself, when he's describing an erotic encounter. He says, you know, I mind how we lay one transparent summer morning. And he talks about, is it his soul? Is it another person? We can't quite tell because of the way the stanzas are arranged. There's a little slippage going on there, that identification of the pronouns. But the person or being that he is with puts his or her face is against Whitman's belly, hand on the beard, hand on the feet, and then stanza break. Swiftly arose around me the peace and knowledge that surpasses all that earth. He describes a kind of huge, gratifying fulfillment, fulfilling everything. He says, and I know that the hand of God is the elder hand of my heart. Extraordinary. The elder hand is Whitman invented later. Extraordinary image. He knows that a kelson of the creation is love. A kelson is that long wooden beam that holds a wooden boat together. So the universe is not only structured, it's held together by love, it's going somewhere. The creation is love. And that passage would be less convincing if it ended at that rhetorical height, but it doesn't. It goes, you know, to see that peace and knowledge also spreading into the stones, the little mossy scabs of the worn fence, the leaves around him. Every little thing is lit up by that vision. And that, to me, is utterly convincing. I think that man was there. So that experience set Song of Myself on fire. That's why that poem glows like it does, because the speaker is almost not human. He is of a piece with all of the world. And you see over the next few years that vision cooling and settling in Whitman's work. By the time we get to Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, one of the greatest poems of that century in American literature than any other, he's in both worlds. He's sort of aglow. He understands that he is not limited by time and space, but he's still Walt Whitman in his body too. And that's very beautiful. That's probably closer to human life than Song of Myself is by much. So I think those experiences were absolutely essential to his work. He said later in his life that his early poems were written in a kind of trance to which he could not will himself to return. And I think that trance must be the gift of those experiences.
Yeah. Will you go to that passage, because there are many visitations, there are many apparitions. This seems to have become something you got good at over the course of your own life.
Something really interests me. Okay, so in Provincetown, where I used to live during the summers, I'd met a man named Frank, and we just sort of hoped to get together. It hadn't happened, and then we were back in New York. The next fall, back in New York, I went one afternoon to Frank's apartment. I don't remember if we'd exchanged numbers or if we saw each other online, or one of the sites that had become increasingly a sexual arena of choice. I hadn't done a lot of online cruising then, and it was exhilarating going to his place, a high-rise on the Upper West Side, having a doorman contact him to let me in, letting the elevator out, Frank opening the door wearing a pair of gym shorts and a thin gray tank top, and then all that followed. I don't know how long we'd been playing, now nearly a universal euphemism used by the gay men I know, and one that cries out for some examination, when I felt, and could feel that Frank felt, it was time for a pause, catch your breath break. I leaned back, sitting on my heels toward the foot of the bed, and looked at him while he sat up against his thick white pillows, leaned his head back and looked at me mildly with a pleasant half smile. And then something happened. I would be hard-pressed to describe any transition between what I saw first, which was my friend's gray-bearded, strongly sculptured face, and what, after a moment, replaced it. It wasn't Frank who looked at me then, but another man with short gray hair and beard, the same half-smile, but with the visionary dazzle of starlight in his eyes. I was, quite calmly, looking into the face of the Walt Whitman of 1856, the year of the Brooklyn daguerreotype, the picture in which he seems to be slowly and with a great inner radiance returning to earth from wherever it is he's been. It's pointless at this juncture to try to defend or explain myself. For whatever reason, through whatever means, I saw what I saw and allowed that face to look directly into my own until I couldn't. Then I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, he was gone. I didn't say anything about it to Frank. I can't tell you anything about the rest of our Congress that afternoon. I looked out over the Hudson before I left, the reddening sun slanting lower, and went down the elevator and into the street with the knowledge of what I had seen held in privacy. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. Later, I understood then why I had gone that afternoon to that sleek, high-rise apartment, the last place I'd expected once again to find myself face-to-face with a ghost. I'll show you the Brooklyn daguerreotype. It's beautiful. And how about you can see this Walt in 1856. The original is in the collection of the New York Public Library. The daguerreotype, so it's on silver. It's very delicate. The darker parts are falling away, so you can't even see it anymore. It's captured in the darkness of the box. And Whitman had to hold this pose for 2 minutes without moving. I just can't imagine keeping that face, that steady, that look all the time. I think there's such a dreaminess and invitation about it. It's described further in the book.
Yeah. Very beautiful. Mark, just quickly, can you stay as close as you were to the mic when you're speaking? Because we've got a comment that some people are having a hard time hearing you. I think that was really good when you were reading.
Right.
Although now I'm hearing a little feedback from myself.
Okay, now I'm going to turn the mic back down a little. How's that?
I think that's better. Although no, I still hear myself. So maybe when I'm speaking, you can turn it down, and then when you're speaking, you can turn it up a little, and I think maybe that'll work. Yeah.
So I should turn it back up when I'm speaking?
Yeah, turn it up when you're speaking because I think people can hear you better. Sorry for that tech note because that is such a beautiful one of so many beautiful passages, and maybe from that moment of Frank and Whitman and you in bed, we can stay with the what you call the second source of poetry, which is queer desire. For Whitman, the seventh chapter you call "Is It Night? Are We Alone?" and you put that in parentheses. That chapter is put in parentheses, and then you speak there and elsewhere again and again. You return to this very beautiful formulation from I think "Song of Myself," where Whitman speaks of the buds folded beneath speech, right? So maybe you can say something about the sayable and the unsayable, both in relation to queer desire, to Whitman's time, and if you like, maybe also just in relation to the nature of language itself and its limits, which you thematize again and again.
Well, it's really interesting to think about what it meant to be a person possessed by same-sex desire in Whitman's era. The 1840s were a time of lots of experimentation. There were many new social movements. It was a time when people had a faith in human perfectibility. And so you get things like the new high-fiber diet invented by Dr. Graham with his graham crackers, nudism, free love, various forms of feminism, communal living, the first translations of literature from Asia, like the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, are appearing, which is why Ralph Waldo Emerson called Song of Myself a cross between the Bhagavad Gita and the New York Herald. That was a wonderful connection to make what was detailed and his combined with his spirituality. So all of that. There was no language really for same-sex desire because there was no category of identity. Desire was a behavior, something that a man might go and have sex with another man, might occur, we think, it's documented, but certainly it was going on. People did not invent a whole new range of sexual practices in the 19th century. they did invent another way of thinking about themselves. And that was partly the development of a kind of new urban person, specifically like a new urban man who was not bound by the way he was known in the way that Walt Whitman would have been had he stayed in Huntington, Long Island. But he came to the city as hundreds of thousands of people did in those days because the American economy was shifting from an agrarian one to an urban one. So lots and lots of people coming into New York suddenly able to be where they wanted to be. A different kind of freedom and possibility occurring. And that meant new senses of identity coming into the foreground. So for Whitman to know that he was a man who loved other men was to have a kind of outsider's perspective that was not yet sort of codified. There was no defined category, right? No descriptor. So he gets to be out on the edge of the social world as it is looking in. And that's why I think of it as a source for his poems, because that lovemaking, that unspoken, undescribed experience was something that was of crucial importance to him. So he's going in a new direction and feeling the life and energy, the sexual charge of that, and that eroticism just floods the poems, particularly the earlier work.
At the same time, now turn me down again while I'm talking.
Oh yeah, sure.
And then if you would really do stay close to the mic when you're talking, I think that will help people.
Okay.
At the same time, so yes, it floods the poetry, and that's so beautifully said. At the same time, a formulation stuck in my mind where you also say that anxiety about the sayable. I think your formulation is it scrambles narrative, and so it does also. How does it shape the poetry also in terms of making it maybe more metaphysical, making it less narrative, or in other ways? Can you say more?
Sure. The unsayable comes in a variety of kinds. One kind of unsayability is when something is considered socially inappropriate or illegal or in some ways forbidden, so you can't say it directly. Another kind is when something is so intense or such a powerful experience that it seems to escape language, that there aren't really words for it. And Whitman is using both those kinds of unsayability in his poems. So for instance, there's a passage in Song of Myself when he describes friendship, and he says, I like to walk out in the crowd and pick some man pick someone who appeals to me, some strong person to be my friend. Then there's a stanza break, and he says, a giant stallion, and he begins to describe this horse who's playing freely and the power and beauty of the stallion. We know he's still talking about the friend from the stanza before, but he doesn't admit it exactly. That stanza break gives him the luxury of moving with a kind of indeterminacy. And so he can, in a way, hide behind that, or you could say he can say more than he could say. It's as if the metaphoric, the erased, the displaced, allows for a ritual kind of discourse. More gets said because it's not said directly. So it's funny that way. He goes back and forth between absolutely directness, unmistakably clear sentences, and then a funny kind of veiling that says sometimes as much or more.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I had an association just now. Well, I think that's pretty complete. And
he's writing those early poems at a time when psychology has not yet really gotten very far on its project of defining the normal personality and the abnormal one. It wasn't long at all before the medicalization of personality really got underway. And Whitman then starts to have to stand back a little bit. That's when you see him changing pronouns, getting a little more nervous, being more veiled in his public presentation. He thought originally that he could really open a territory. And then he learned that it wasn't that easy. He also was caught in a terrific conflict, which in some ways shaped his life a great deal. He wanted to be a sexual radical. He wanted to be a prophet. He wanted to talk about new ways of being. And he also really wanted to be loved. And it's very hard to pull both of those things off at the same time, right? How could he be a beloved public figure and also be preaching sexual anarchy in a way?
Mhm. Yeah, but I do think that the pressure that this creates on him to invent formally is something that you explore just beautifully in the book, and we forget how much he did invent. You know, those line breaks.
Straight.
It's him. It's not just the free verse. It's also all those things, and it's very compelling to read that in conjunction with the impetus and this wellspring of queer desire that is behind that. It's really incredible.
So often different kinds of restrictions really are, the mother of style.
Yeah, in poetry for sure. Yeah. So I'm going to skip a couple of the five sources for a second. We might come back to them. I also want to just pause and say, feel free at any moment to put your questions into that Ask a Question as you have them, and they will stay there because we will definitely, I'm definitely going to leave time. So as you have a question, just put those in that question queue. What I want to move to is so yes, you have this hymn to life in all its physicality, in its vitality, and to the possibility of knowing what we know and sharing it only through the body, right? And through being alive to our senses, all of that. But it seems that would probably not move us so much if the poems didn't know as much about our finitude and our death, right? I think those belong very closely together. And you already mentioned, you hinted at a development there from Song of Myself to Brooklyn Ferry, but you have a beautiful explanation of and development of that thought when you talk about Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, and so if you could draw that arc as in relationship to how he helps us think about finitude and how he experiences death from that early moment to the Out of the Cradle poem,
Song of Myself
where
is,
the source of his writing.
Song of Myself is a radiant solar poem, in which the speaker can say, the smallest sprout shows there really is no death. And, for us, he says, I am deathless. I shall not pass like a child's cruelty drawn with a burnt stick on the night. He believes that in that poem because he isn't limited to being just his singular self. He is everything, and everything doesn't die. Everything goes on. As his vision cools, as he's more, well, let's say, as he is a limited human being as well as an enlightened one, sort of simultaneously, then the death of the individual becomes more real. If you stand at a great cosmic distance, individuality doesn't matter much. An individual loss is just a little piece. But if you stand close to another person, an animal, whatever you love, and you know that life is finite, that it will end, then how can you not be moved by that? How can you not be, in some ways, broken and challenged by that? So that understanding comes more and more to bear as the poems go on. And in this great poem that you described, Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, which is an extraordinary performance, Whitman describes being a little boy in Long Island and going out at night down to the beach, walking through farmland. It's kind of hallucinatory, long first sentence, down to the water. And what he finds there is a mockingbird. It's flown all the way from the south someplace, and there are a pair of them. And then later, there's only one left. And the bird that's left is looking out to sea and singing. And its song will call its mate back. And Whitman has the nerve to actually translate the song into English for us. And it goes on, it's page and a half long, many, many exclamation points. This is the most Victorian and operatic of Whitman's poems. It's really something. And after he listens to this bird singing, he says a remarkable thing. He says, now I know what I'm for. Meaning that song, which laments loss, which stands in the face of death and continues to sing into silence, is a mark of his vocation. It's who he will be in this world. He says, demon or bird, he doesn't know which it is, because it's granted him this mission, which he will be fulfilling for the rest of his life. Remarkable poem. And it feels like it's a great transition away from the confidence about immortality the comfort of being part of it all, towards, real grief. And I guess, how could you write a poetry that does not admit grief, right? It's just simply not possible. And so he had to move towards that. There's something very beautiful about watching this generous, faithful spirit also having to encounter what it means to lose. What it means to lose what you love.
And you offer the reader a kind of small mirror experience from your own life, that I think in that chapter where your partner has an accident, right, and is at home, and your two dogs find what to do in that moment. They find how to be with,
yes,
by being close. And you have your own little stanza break there, and I forget how you say it, but you say, and what is it for me to do, right? So the dogs had found what it is. And how do you answer that? I don't remember your formulation, but it echoes Whitman, does it not, in that moment?
Version of, now I know what I'm for. My job is to witness. My job is to say it as clearly as I can, so that the experience, can be held up into the light and shared. If I can say what it is to feel that moment in which, a door out of this world sort of opened, and he almost went through it and didn't, then I make that experience not something just limited to me, not something private, but something which can be a touchstone or an artifact of my for others, so that people bring their shared experience to bear upon it. That's what poetry does. It makes a meeting ground where that which we might have to bear alone, we don't have to anymore, because we find it in somebody else's life. We can see a commonality in our difference. It makes us larger. And it, in some way, makes it difficult a little more bearable.
Yeah.
Because it's not, your feelings are not strange and peculiar. You are not alone with this, whatever this loss or terror or pleasure can be. But that others are there.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful pairing in that moment of the book. I was struck, this is a small point, that for Whitman, his own most sustained and direct experience of death is as a volunteer during this. Oh, we've lost Mark.
Oh, you lost me?
We lost your camera somehow. Oh, right, we can see you.
I see myself and the camera's on, but you don't see me.
I don't see you. I don't know if others can see you. I'm gonna let's see. I'm going to focus you.
Okay.
No, that doesn't change it.
There I am.
I'm going to toggle your camera off, and then I'm going to toggle it back on. Oh, we've lost you. You lost it. Does your computer show a little light for the
my camera light is on, and I see you, and I see myself.
How peculiar. Well, hopefully other people are seeing you also, and hopefully just me who isn't seeing you.
People out there, let us know. Are you seeing me at all?
Can someone tell me in the chat whether you're seeing Mark? Hang on. Can't see Mark, just a green screen.
Boy.
I don't know how. Oh, there you are. You're back.
Oh, good. Okay.
Well done. Well done. You disappeared for a moment in order to make us appreciate your return. Okay, good.
We're talking about death. I went out for a little bit.
Exactly. You went out for a little bit. What I was saying is that Whitman's experience of death as a volunteer during the Civil War, as a volunteer nurse, is only sort of glancingly plotted in your book, right? And I just was curious about that.
Well, I wanted to focus the book because, Whitman wrote a great many poems. It's a very full career. I wanted to focus on the very great, what I see as being the very great work, which I think ends in 1860. There are interesting and valuable poems beyond that. The great ones have happened by then in his life. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that contradiction, that conflict between the desire to be a radical, to be a leader and a spokesperson, and to be loved. And that contradiction tore at him and damaged his work. He also was profoundly disappointed after the Civil War. he had hoped, that he would see a democratic union founded on the love of comrades. He believed that he could prophesy that. And what he saw instead were the soldiers tearing each other apart in ever more brutal ways, courtesy of advanced technology. It was heartbreaking to him. He spent 2 years volunteering in the improvised hospitals in DC after the war. And what he saw there were barbaric conditions. There was no germ theory of disease at the time. The surgical instruments were not disinfected. You can imagine what it was like there. It broke his health. He had afterwards a terrible stroke and was really never able to, I think, rise to the heights he could before. He'd done so much already. How could I ask for more of him?
Yeah.
That didn't seem like part of the book. I did just write an essay about Whitman working in the hospitals, which will be in American Poetry Review this summer.
Great. So a supplement.
I thought I was. I still keep writing more.
Yeah, I want to actually, as we head towards the audience's questions, I want to get to your reading of another one. Can you just lower my mic for a second? I want to get to your reading of another one of the great poems, which is Crossing the Brooklyn Ferry. Mm-hmm. We're skipping a little bit New York City and the very particular American spoken idiom and lexicon, which each get a chapter as also sources in Whitman's poetry. But I want to get to this reading of Crossing the Brooklyn Ferry. By the time, then it's gorgeous. And by the time the book gets to that, the reader is sort of well prepared and has all these dimensions that we've talked about, and in addition, the backdrop of New York and of this kind of American lexicon in her mind. I thought that maybe I could invite you to read 2 pages. They're on 264 and 65, because that's a place where so many of the ways in which you read Whitman are kind of in full play. And then while you're listening to that, if you have a question, start formulating that, and we will have time for those when Mark has read those 2 pages.
The book ends with Crossing Brooklyn Ferry because I think it is Whitman's masterwork. It's a poem in which he sets out, which he does exactly what he sets out to do, which is to tell us that space and time are not limiting. We are not bound in time, we are not bound in space, that he can be alive as a voice now, that he can speak to readers of the future. At this point, when this guy published this poem, he had no audience, but he calls one into being here. And he was right, it works. So this is a little description of part of that, a portion of that poem. It's about a section of the poem where he asks, what is it then between us? The poem's next section begins with a question. How many years have elapsed between the writing of his poem and your reading of it? Scores? Hundreds? Whatever it is, he reiterates, slightly varying his statement from section 2, distance avails not, and place avails not. The repeated phrases sort of spell, intended to intervene in the movement and character of time by establishing a new position from which to speak. The bonds, affections, cities, questions, the poet knows he shares with his readers, though they may be hundreds of years apart, overrule any sense of separation. 2 remarkable statements complete this argument, 2 radical propositions placed here at the section's closed. The first is a claim as mysterious as anything in Whitman's poetry. I, too, he writes, had been struck from the float, forever held in suspension. What did he mean? It sounds like a sort of manufacturing method, some industrial vocabulary he might have gleaned from the Crystal Palace exhibition, but I can find no evidence to support this idea. Struck as sparks might be struck, each more or less identical, as the poet suggests in another poem. Men and women passing in the streets. If they are not flashes and specks, what are they? Or struck, as we say, coins or metals are struck from a mold. Is the float something solid, like a bar of silver used in an electroplating process, in which molecules of silver might be transferred to another waiting surface? Or should we think of the float as something liquid or in suspension, in the sense that Whitman uses the word in Song of the Open Road? Something there is in the float of the sight of things that provokes it out of the soul. Something there is in the float of the sight of things that provokes it out of the soul. It, in this line, is wisdom, and the float in question is a procession of objects before our eyes, Is the float forever held in solution then a perpetual flux, an endless source from which we are each in some way catalyzed, so that whatever our differences shaped by history and culture, language and social position, we are, at the flashpoint of our beginning, joined? If we are all struck from the float forever held in solution, whatever it may be, sparked or minted and catalyzed from that same source, then how to account for individuality? The lines that follow answer, forming a second proposition. I too had received identity by my body. That I knew was of my body. And what I should be, I knew I should be of my body. Out of the range of categories a person might occupy, how many are determined by the flesh itself? Male or female, trans or intersex, gay or straight, and what are the range of human skin tones, or the other characteristics we consider aspects of race, with all the social, culturally determined consequences they bring with them? Tall or short, ecto or endomorph, hairy, smooth, symmetrical or misaligned, they seem nearly endless, the myriad ways the self is shaped by the particular givens of the body, though we aren't always certain what's given and what is not. It's only through the body, Whitman asserts, through sense perception, that we know we exist.
Yeah, so masterful, and I hope that everyone on this live stream can get a sense between the apparition part where you are face to face with Whitman, and now this just the range of narrative and of modes and voices of your own in this book. It's what I love about the passage that you just read, and also is that you make so clear that another invention of Whitman's is the asking of questions as a method of building a poem, and it seems you've adopted that to very good effect.
When he asks us a question, it makes us feel included.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a genuine question. Sometimes it's a question that's sort of there to, earn our complicity. But they always advance the poem in interesting ways. They serve as transitions into deeper levels of meaning.
Yeah. So I have gotten to ask all these questions, and now I want to turn to some questions from people who have been tuned in.
Sure.
Several want to know, how do you see queer poets today approaching the unsayable? And someone is thinking in particular of Charles Field and many poets who use more direct language. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the approaches and methods today?
We have such a different permission to speak at this point in history, and we have the language to do so. But there are always things that fall out of speech, right? There are always aspects of experience that are harder to name, that are subtler, and there are those that we have less, cultural or social permission to name. So I think that's a constant in our poetry. Nothing will ever be entirely available, entirely direct. We won't ever be able to completely name. Because when you name something right on the head, no matter how exact you are, there's always something that isn't quite caught that way, right? One of the great beauties of reading Whitman is to see how the very direct, a loving erotic description of a body sits next to something really indirect. He talks about landscape sprouting, masculine and golden, beside a railroad track. What is that? What's the landscape that is masculine? He's seeing something else in the natural world, identifying maybe a different kind of creation story. He's far from Mother Nature there. He's going to a mythic or an abstract level, and I think that's always going to be true. And you can't hold everything in clear speech. So I don't think the indirect and the unsayable are in danger. There's always more there. I hope that answers the question. Oh, I've lost you. It's your sound. Not hearing you, Dorothy. I'm sorry.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So there's a couple people who are also wanting to know who are, to you, some of the essential modern poets. They would include you, and maybe that's a good segue from this question of indirectness in poetry. Who is essential in your own pantheon?
Talking about this moment right now, or are we talking about a longer period of modernity? I would put modern back to 1920s. So.
Yeah, I mean, Emily Dickinson is in your book a lot as somebody who didn't read Whitman. But you keep bringing her back.
She's a great example of being modern with outside of time, because the fact that those poems include multiple choices for words that can be put in different places, the fact that her forms are so slippery, even now in editing her manuscripts, you can't always tell where a line should end. There are her dashes which go in different directions. Perhaps that has meaning. There's an indeterminacy in the poetry that makes her feel especially modern to me. And talk about somebody who sort of refuses to the direct statement. She's almost always oblique in really interesting ways. So, right at the moment, I would embrace wholeheartedly my friend Marie Howe, who I think is an extraordinary writer. I love Lucy Bartolotto's work. Let's see, Ross Gay, I think absolutely terrific. Tahimba Jess, Jericho Brown, my former student, who I want to say just won the Pulitzer. By the way. I was very curious about that. A few years ago, a friend of mine said to me, I said to a friend, "Oh, my first student just won the Pulitzer," and she said, "How many do you think they're going to be?" Well, I think you're doing good. Yeah. So there's a few.
There's a few.
Coming up with names and spur of the moment that way. I have to get in focus.
Well, but that's a good reading list for already.
Good.
Someone here wants to return to his reading of Whitman. This is Andy asking, I've always felt that Whitman was expert on translating the unfiltered human condition into words with nuanced energies, like standing in a mirror even for some, and asking how you feel about that idea of standing in a mirror.
The unfiltered human experience, is that going into?
Yeah.
And what was right after that?
Well, the formulation is like standing in a mirror, so that it's like holding up a mirror, I guess, to the human condition.
Yeah, I think so too. He's really incredibly a poet of the body. He says, "I'm the poet of the body and the poet of the soul," but he never is all one way or the other. And so, physicality in that work, what it is to be made of skin and muscle, to touch, to feel impression on the body, to feel the presence of the body in place. I wonder, he was a very tall guy, and he was big and much bigger than most men around him and at that time, and he took up a lot of space. And he was famous for a lot of lounging, loafing, lying around. He seems to have been a big physical presence. So it's interesting to think about if that might have influenced that quality in his work. So, and you can say, I see the identity of my body. Nobody else in the 19th century is going to say that.
Yeah.
So his physicality is really crucial to him. And you're right that he knows how to translate senses and to communicate to us something of feeling that is beneath those senses. So that's part of the buds folded in the speech.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we will give the last question to a question that several people are curious about, which is a more personal question to you of how you are living this moment of social distancing.
Oh, well, I don't need to tell you, it's up and down. I've been isolated pretty much for 2 months, and I'm very tired of it. I'm so grateful to go to the grocery store, honestly, or go to the post office. Most of the conversations I have are with other people walking dogs on the street, and that's wonderful. It is trying. I do not relate at all to the people who say, "Oh, I have so much time on my hand. I'm reading War and Peace and baking and learning Chinese." Teaching online is a huge amount of work. It's managing a lot of detail, responding to my students online. I'm also been doing some projects for magazines, and I have a book come out at this moment.
Right.
Attention too. It's that weird feeling that there was a book tour that didn't happen, but it did happen online and communication with people individually. So that's been a lot. I will be glad when I can walk outside without a mask, shake someone's hand, go to a restaurant. That's coming. Yes, that's coming.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial that we don't do those things too soon. But I have faith they're coming. And Walt Whitman is a very good person to read right now for those reasons. His faith in what it is to be human, his pleasure in what it is to be human.
Yeah. And for all that affirmation. So, when I returned to him, I just felt like you can summarize Song of Myself in the word yes.
His faith in the future. And he says, women of a generation hence. I considered of you long before you were even born. He knows that there will be people there when he's gone. And I think it's a little harder for us to feel that faith, but if we can hold on to a bit of it, it helps.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good place in which to thank you for this hour we've spent together. I will say to everybody that this is also recorded, so if you have friends who might want to listen in, or if you want to return to this conversation, also if people who couldn't make it yesterday, I'll make sure that they get a link to this recording, and then they can tune in. Mark has also offered to sign some signing plates, so we will send him a badge and he'll return those to us. Another good reason, if you want to buy a copy, having listened in of What is the Grass, Walt Whitman in my life. I didn't ask you what is the grass, but of course I could have and maybe should have. It would have led to many of the same conversations that we had, I think. So if you would like... What's that?
I really want to thank the people who came back. It was very good of you. Appreciate it. Sorry that you that we were delayed, but you had faith in the future.
That's right. That's right. Yes, and I urge you to read this beautiful book. It will take you out of time for a minute and locate you very much inside yourself. So, Mark, thank you. All of you, thank you, and have a peaceful, good evening in your homes. Take good care. Bye-bye. Bye, Mark.